Sermons in Cats. I met, not long ago, a young man who aspired to become a novelist. Knowing that I was in the profession, he asked me to tell him how he should set to work to realize his ambition. I did my best to explain. The first thing, I said, is to buy quite a lot of paper, a bottle of ink, and a pen. After that you merely have to write. But this was not enough for my young friend. He seemed to have a notion that there was some sort of esoteric cookery book, full of literary recipes, which you had only to follow attentively to become a Dickens, a Henry James, a Flaubert according to taste, as the authors of recipes say, when they come to the question of seasoning and sweetening. Wouldn't I let him have a glimpse of this cookery book? I said that I was sorry, but that, unhappily for what an endless amount of time and trouble it would save, I had never even seen such a work. He seemed sadly disappointed, so, to console the poor lad, I advised him to apply to the professors of dramaturgy and short story writing at some reputable university. If anyone possessed a trustworthy cookery book of literature, it should surely be they. But even this was not enough to satisfy the young man. Disappointed in his hope that I would give him the fictional equivalent of 100 Ways of Cooking Eggs or the Carnet de la Ménagère, he began to cross-examine me about my methods of collecting material. Did I keep a notebook or a daily journal? Did I jot down thoughts and phrases in a card index? Did I systematically frequent the drawing rooms of the rich and fashionable? Or did I, on the contrary, inhabit the Sussex Downs? Or spend my evenings looking for copy in East End gin palaces? Did I think it was wise to frequent the company of intellectuals? Was it a good thing for a writer of novels to try to be well educated, or should he confine his reading exclusively to other novels? And so on. I did my best to reply to these questions as non-committally, of course, as I could. And as the young man still looked rather disappointed, I volunteered a final piece of advice, gratuitously. My young friend, I said, if you want to be a psychological novelist and write about human beings, the best thing you can do is to keep a pair of cats. And with that I left him. I hope, for his own sake, that he took my advice. For it was good advice, the fruit of much experience and many meditations. But I am afraid that, being a rather foolish young man, he merely laughed at what he must have supposed was only a silly joke, laughed, as I myself foolishly laughed when, years ago, that charming and talented and extraordinary man, Ronald Furbank, once told me that he wanted to write a novel about life in Mayfair and so was just off to the West Indies to look for copy among the Negroes. I laughed at the time, but I see now that he was quite right. Primitive people, like children and animals, are simply civilized people with the lid off, so to speak, the heavy elaborate lid of manners, conventions, traditions of thought and feeling beneath which each one of us passes his or her existence. This lid can be very conveniently studied in Mayfair, shall we say, or Parsi, or Park Avenue. But what goes on underneath the lid in these polished and elegant districts? Direct observation, unless we happen to be endowed with a very penetrating intuition, tells us but little, and, if we cannot infer what is going on under other lids from what we see, introspectively, by peeping under our own, then the best thing we can do is to take the next boat for the West Indies, or else, less expensively, pass a few mornings in the nursery, or alternatively, as I suggested to my literary young friend, buy a pair of cats. Yes, a pair of cats. Siamese by preference, for they are certainly the most human of all the race of cats. Also the strangest, and, if not the most beautiful, certainly the most striking and fantastic. For what disquieting pale blue eyes stare out from the black velvet mask of their faces. Snow white at birth, their bodies gradually dark into a rich mulatto color. Their forepaws are gloved almost to the shoulder like the long black kid arms of Yvette Gilbert, over their hind legs are tightly drawn the black silk stockings with which Felician Rops so perversely and indecently clothed his pearly nudes. Their tails, when they have tails, and I would always recommend the budding novelist to buy the tailed variety, for the tail, in cat, is the principal organ of emotional expression, and a Manx cat is the equivalent of a dumb man. Their tails are tapering black serpents endowed, even when the body lies in sphinx-like repose, with a spasmodic and uneasy life of their own. And what strange voices they have! Sometimes like the complaining of small children, sometimes like the noise of lambs, sometimes like the agonized and furious howling of lost souls. Compared with these fantastic creatures, other cats, however beautiful and engaging, are apt to seem a little insipid. Well, having bought his cat, nothing remains for their would-be novelist but to watch them living from day to day, to mark, learn, and inwardly digest the lessons about human nature which they teach, and finally for, alas, this arduous and unpleasant necessity always arises, finally write his book about Mayfair, Parsi, or Park Avenue, whichever the case may be. Let us consider some of these instructive sermons in Cats, from which the student of human psychology can learn so much. We will begin as every good novel should begin, instead of absurdly ending with marriage. The marriage of Siamese cats, at any rate as I have observed it, is an extraordinarily dramatic event. To begin with, the introduction of the bridegroom to his bride. I am assuming that, as usually happens in the world of cats, they have not met before their wedding day, is the signal for a battle of unparalleled ferocity. The young wife's first reaction to the advances of her would-be husband is to fly at his throat. One is thankful, as one watches the fur flying and listens to the piercing yells of rage and hatred, that a kindly providence has not allowed these devils to grow any larger. Waged between creatures as big as men, such battles would bring death and destruction to everything within a radius of hundreds of yards. As things are, one is able, at the risk of a few scratches, to grab the combatants by the scruffs of their necks and drag them, still writhing and spitting, apart. What would happen if the newly wedded pair were allowed to go on fighting to the bitter end I do not know, and have never had the scientific curiosity or the strength of mind to try to find out. I suspect that, contrary to what happened in Hamlet's family, the wedding bake meats would soon be serving for a funeral. I have always prevented this tragical consummation by simply shutting up the bride in a room by herself and leaving the bridegroom for a few hours to languish outside the door. He does not languish dumbly, but for a long time there is no answer, save an occasional hiss or growl, to his melancholy cries of love. When, finally, the bride begins replying in tones as soft and yearning as his own, the door may be opened. The bridegroom darts in and is received, not with tooth and claw as on the former occasion, but with every demonstration of affection. At first sight there would seem, in this specimen of feline behavior, no special message for humanity. But appearances are deceptive. The lids under which civilized people live are so thick and so profusely sculptured with mythological ornaments, that it is difficult to recognize the fact, so much insisted upon by D.H. Lawrence in his novels and stories, that there is almost always a mingling of hate with the passion of love, and that young girls very often feel, in spite of their sentiments and even their desires, a real abhorrence of the fact of physical love. Unlidded, the cats make manifest this ordinarily obscure mystery of human nature. After witnessing a cat's wedding, no young novelist can rest content with the falsehood and banalities which pass, in current fiction, for descriptions of love. Time passes and, their honeymoon over, the cats begin to tell us things about humanity which even the lid of civilization cannot conceal in the world of men. They tell us, what? Alas! We already know that husbands soon tire of their wives, particularly when they are expecting or nursing families, that the essence of maleness is the love of adventure and infidelity, that guilty consciences and good resolutions are the psychological symptoms of that disease which spasmodically affects practically every male between the ages of 18 and 60, the disease called the morning after, and that with the disappearance of the disease the psychological symptoms also disappear, so that when temptation comes again, conscience is dumb and good resolutions count for nothing. All these unhappily too familiar truths are illustrated by the cats with a most comical absence of disguise. No man has ever dared to manifest his boredom so insolently as does a Siamese tomcat, when he yawns in the face of his amorously importunate wife. No man has ever dared to proclaim his illicit amours so frankly as this same tomcat walling on the tiles. And how slinkingly no man was ever so abject he returns next day to the conjugal basket by the fire. You can measure the guiltiness of his conscience by the angle of his back-pressed ears, the droop of his tail. And when, having sniffed him and so discovered his infidelity, his wife, as she always does on these occasions, begins to scratch his face, already scarred, like a German student's, with the traces of 100 duels, he makes no attempt to resist, for, self-convicted of sin, he knows that he deserves all he is getting. It is impossible for me in the space at my disposal to enumerate all the human truths which a pair of cats can reveal or confirm. I will cite only one more of the innumerable sermons in Cats which my memory holds, an acted sermon which, by its ludicrous pantomime, vividly brought home to me the most saddening peculiarity of our human nature, its irreducible solitariness. The circumstances were these. My she-cat, by now a wife of long standing and several times a mother, was passing through one of her occasional phases of amorousness. Her husband, now in the prime of life and parading that sleepy arrogance which is the characteristic of the mature and conquering male, he was now the feline equivalent of some Herculean young Alcibiades of the Guards, refused to have anything to do with her. It was in vain that she uttered her lovesick mewing. In vain that she walked up and down in front of him rubbing herself voluptuously against doors and chair legs as she passed. It was in vain that she came and licked his face. He shut his eyes, he yawned, he averted his head, or, if she became too importunate, got up and slowly, with an insulting air of dignity and detachment, stalked away. When the opportunity presented itself, he escaped and spent the next 24 hours upon the tiles. Left to herself, the wife went wandering disconsolately about the house, as though in search of a vanished happiness, faintly and plaintively mewing to herself in a voice and with a manner that reminded one irresistibly of Melisande in Debussy's opera. Je ne suis pas heureuse ici, she seemed to be saying. And, poor little beast, she wasn't. But, like her big sisters and brothers of the human world, she had to bear her unhappiness in solitude, uncomprehended, unconsoled. For in spite of language, in spite of intelligence and intuition and sympathy, one can never really communicate anything to anybody. The essential substance of every thought and feeling remains incommunicable, locked up in the impenetrable strong room of the individual soul and body. Our life is a sentence of perpetual solitary confinement. This mournful truth was overwhelmingly borne in on me as I watched the abandoned and lovesick cat as she walked unhappily round my room. Je ne suis pas heureuse ici, she kept mewing, je ne suis pas heureuse ici. And her expressive black tail would lash the air in a tragical gesture of despair. But each time it twitched, hopla, from under the armchair, from behind the bookcase, wherever he happened to be hiding at the moment, out jumped her only son, the only one, that is, we had not given away, jumped like a ludicrous toy tiger, all claws out, onto the moving tail. Sometimes he would miss, sometimes he caught it, and getting the tip between his teeth would pretend to worry it, absurdly ferocious. His mother would have to jerk it violently to get it out of his mouth. Then, he would go back under his armchair again and, crouching down, his hindquarters trembling, would prepare once more to spring. The tail, the tragical, despairingly gesticulating tail, was for him the most irresistible of playthings. The patience of the mother was angelical. There was never a rebuke or a punitive reprisal. When the child became too intolerable, she just moved away, that was all. And meanwhile, all the time, she went on mewing, plaintively, despairingly. Je ne suis pas heureuse ici, je ne suis pas heureuse ici. It was heartbreaking. The more so as the antics of the kitten were so extraordinarily ludicrous. It was as though a slapstick comedian had broken in on the lamentations of Melisande, not mischievously, not wittingly, for there was not the smallest intention to hurt in the little cat's performance, but simply from lack of comprehension. Each was alone serving his life sentence of solitary confinement. There was no communication from cell to cell. Absolutely no communication. These sermons in